Now we're going to finish up muscles of the arm by covering the flexors and extensors found in the forearm. Couple things I want to note before we get started. When you think of muscles that follow your thumb, I want you to think radius. When you think of muscles that follow your pinky, I want you to think ulnaris or your ulna. These are muscles that are going to literally be next to your ulna and your radius bones, even though you can't see them. So I always think of the thumb side being the most lateral. That's where your radius bone is going to sit, and that's why these muscles are named radialis muscles. Same thing with the ulna being associated to the pinky. So as long as you have those two concepts down, this will be actually pretty easy for you. Another thing to note is the extensors in your forearm are located on the posterior region of your arm. So right here, we can tell based on how the hand is sitting that this is your posterior side. And so as we move over to these muscles, these will be your extensors. As we flip the model over to the anterior side, based again how that hand is sitting, you're going to find your flexors. And remember, flexors are going to decrease that angle. So that's how we know that these are going to be your flexors. The last thing you'll need to note is that the brachioradialis is going to be the north star of your forearm that divides your extensors from your flexors. So it's really important that you know where this muscle is if you don't want to get those two concepts mixed up. If you're confused, you can either watch the video previously where I covered the forearm, or you can just find your humerus bone that leads you to your brachialis and then touches onto your brachioradialis. I consider this the north star of your forearm because, again, it's going to divide those flexors and extensors. Lastly, one thing I really want to emphasize with this exam, it is a longer exam, so we will give you a little extra time, and we'll also give you a little leeway with spelling because there are more words that we expect you to spell for each of the terms. But I don't want you to go through this and just memorize these terms. Watch throughout the video as I emphasize the terminology used to describe these muscles and realize it's not really a memorization test, it's a do you understand terminology test. And we'll lead with an example. So like I said, anytime you get confused, always find your brachioradialis. It's always going to lead you in the right direction. So the first terms are going to be here and here, and you want to ask yourself, are these flexors or the extensors? As we look at the brachioradialis and we see that it's dividing the two sides from posterior and anterior, we see that this muscle and this muscle lie on the posterior side. So we know that these are your extensors. And remember, this rule isn't for every part of your body. This is just a rule for your forearm. Your extensors or flexors are actually opposite in your leg. But again, I just want to reiterate that for your forearm, the extensors will be on your posterior side. Okay, so we got that checked. So we know these are both called extensors. Okay, perfect. So the next thing you want to ask yourself, where's this muscle going? So this muscle and this muscle are going into the wrist. And what do we know that's in the wrist that's an incredibly important bone? The carpals. So I always think extensor going into the carpals, carpi, and it's going on the side of the thumb, radialis. So we know these two muscles are extensor, carpi, radialis muscles. Now which one is which? Well, thankfully people who decided to name muscles came up with some really great terminology. So the first muscle is going to be your extensor, carpi, radialis, longus, and extensor, carpi, radialis, brevis. I don't really know what the Latin breakdown is for brevis. I'm assuming it means brief or small. At least that's what I always think of, because this is always going to be the smaller muscle of the two, even if you can't always see it on the model itself. So extensor, carpi, radialis, longus, and extensor, carpi, radialis, brevis. Also note how slow I'm talking. Even though I've covered this term before and I'm making a video, I'm talking really slow so that you can work through these exactly the same way. Is it an extensor or is it a flexor? Where is it going? Is it going into the digits or is it going into the carpals? And then you have to ask yourself, is it on the thumb side or pinky side? If you follow these tricks, you'll be able to actually get through this exam with no problem. This is also an extensor, but it's going directly into the digits and it's going to help extend them. So we call this muscle extensor digitorum. The last muscle is going to be really easy. It's this muscle right here, and it goes right into the pinky side. And just like we named our radialis, we're going to name this extensor Carpi because it extends into the carpals, just like the radialis muscle did, and it's going to extend into the pinky side. What bone's on the pinky side? The ulna bone. So we call this extensor carpi ulnaris. There are two muscles we used to have you know. They're located here and here. There's extensor pollicis longus, which is actually this muscle here, and extensor pollicis brevis. But these are kind of obscure muscles for students to find on an exam, and I'm not a big fan of just making you memorize muscles on a piece of plastic just for the sake of it. So note in your terms list, I gave you the actual actions of the muscles, and I want you to know that they're deep within the wrist. So that's what I'm going to test you on for the exam, but just so you know where they're located, they're going to be located deep. And what are they going to do exactly? They're going to work with the thumb, which is why it gets the name pollicis, and they're going to have a specific action. So as we go to the anterior side of your muscles, again, find your brachioradialis muscle, which is right here. And now we're on the flexor side. So we know we're on the flexor side because we're on the anterior side of your body. Again, I'm going to reiterate this because students will still get confused. This rule only applies to your forearm. It does not apply to your legs, which actually has the same rule, but it's opposite. So again, following our little trick, we're on the flexor side because brachioradialis is here, and we know we're on the anterior side because of the hand. And then we have this muscle that's a flexor that goes into the wrist, follows the thumb. So we call this flexor carpi radialis. We'll just do this one really quick just because it's easy. This muscle here is flexor carpi ulnaris. Like I said, they're really easy because they have antagonistic muscles. So the extensors are going to have an antagonistic muscle that does the opposite action on the other side. So if you're noticing the extensor carpi ulnaris and flexor carpi ulnaris terminology, that was very much intentional. Those muscles are named because they're antagonistic to each other. The only difference is you have to figure out which ones are anterior and which ones are posterior. The last couple muscles we'll cover is going to be Palmaris longus, which is helping to flex the wrist. But then, as you squeeze deeper into this muscle here, you'll notice your fingers start to go as well. And so this is Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. So Palmaris longus helps to flex the wrist into the palm, and then the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis is going to help flex the fingers. You can even try this on your own by squeezing. I can't really show you exactly, but if you start to squeeze your wrist at the top of your elbow, your wrist will start to move, and then you'll start to feel your fingers move. And that's the Palmaris longus and Flexor Digitorum Superficialis being triggered. Now, I want you to note that this is a really, I don't like the name of this muscle, the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis, because it makes students think that this muscle is superficial. And it is relative to other muscles, but if we look at Palmaris longus, it sits right on top of it. So how it got the name superficialis, I'm not quite sure, but just note that in your notes that that is named as such. Another term here, we had the longus and brevis. We used to only test flexor, pollicis longus. It's a deep muscle, again, going into the thumb, and it's going to help to it's going to help provide an action to the thumb. And so we can't see brevis on here, but I just wanted to note that that's where it's located, but we're not going to test you on that one either. We're just going to test you on the actions, because I think those will be more beneficial just because they're deep muscles and it's a little harder to see. So anytime you think of pollicis, for these terms, you'd have to take those pieces off in order to see it. Okay, so that wraps it up for this video. I will make a shorter video so you can review these a little bit quicker, but I did want to give kind of a lecture-based overview of these muscles.